So our next section is called Faces of Life. And this is really one of my favorite parts of the day. But I would be remiss to mention Faces of Life without mentioning a couple of old ex-lifers that are in the room. Vance Bartley and Stephen Dozier used to sit right where we sit. We're a part of our group, and we're two of the rare folks that made it out. So we're glad you're here today, guys, under these circumstances, and good to have you here. In your handout, you may have read several sections entitled Faces of Life in Prison and wondered what that is. Let me explain. Today, you'll hear from 6 men who have very long prison sentences, including 3 serving life without the possibility of parole. Our goal is to give you a snapshot into who a lifer really is. These men were not chosen because they are the most eloquent speakers or they had the slickest stories. They were chosen because they represent hundreds of thousands of prisoners across America serving life sentences. You won't find any of these guys on MSNBC lockup. These are the true faces of life in prison. Our first 2 faces of life are Robbie Burton and Christopher Blackwell. Please welcome them. This would be the time where you come forward.
Hello. I'd like to thank you for attending our conference. Let me introduce myself. My name is Robbie Burton. I'm serving a life sentence, life without parole, under the Persistent Offender Act. I'm a 3-striker. I'm working on my 20th year. Here are some of the labels that we've gone by in the last 33 years. First, we were convicts, then inmates, now we're offenders. As a 60-year-old man, things look much different now than they did in 1981 when I first arrived here for my first armed robbery conviction. When I think about how I ended up here with no hope of release, I know I did this to myself. I think it began back in 1971 when I joined the United States Coast Guard. There I was introduced to heroin from Vietnam, and by the end of 1972, my life revolved around getting and using drugs. So when I ended up here, it was no surprise to me or anyone else. I continued to use narcotics at all costs, coming back to prison over and over. The point I want to make is those days are over. Through work and education, I found a solution. There's an old lie told that once an addict, always an addict. Don't believe that lie. People change. No one can be the same man he was 20 years ago. For me, I know I don't see the world as I once did. Life here in prison has changed me from a man who cared little for anyone but himself to someone that wants to try to make a difference. Working with other addicts, I found a way to try to make amends for all my criminal behavior. I know I can never fully make up for everything that I've done. I can only try and make a difference. So for the last 2 decades, I've worked on myself through education and working on projects for the community, trying to show that men here in prison are redeemable and that many of us care about our community here in prison and the community at large. If you think about what the world was like 100 years ago, I would have been hung for the armed robberies I committed. We know the world's changed since then. We know people can change. I have changed. I feel it's time for us to take a second look at all the men and women with unrealistic release dates and people like myself with no release date at all. Once again, I want to thank you guys for coming and taking the time to hear what we have to say. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm gonna be a little nervous. I've never done this before, and I'm the person that hides when the teacher says who wants to read or something in class. So good afternoon. My name is Christopher Blackwell. I've been in prison for the last 10 years, and I have about 29 left to go, something in which I only have myself to blame for. When I committed my crime, I was a confused young man. I was 22 years old, and I used to think that money was the most important thing in this world. This way of thinking led me to do many foolish things to obtain it. robbing houses, selling drugs, robbing drug dealers, and anything else I could basically do. The list could go on and on of the selfish things I have done, but by far the worst was on June 15th of 2003. After drinking until 5 a.m. in the morning, I decided to go rob somebody. By the end of that night, a young man's life was taken. I'd thought about that night a lot, how fast everything had happened. How in one moment a life had been taken and I couldn't even explain how or why it happened. But the why doesn't matter. What does matter is that a life was taken. Today I realize how important a life is and the people I hurt by my actions, my selfish actions. From that moment on, my life was changed forever. Many lives were changed forever. And it would never be the same. My selfishness had finally caught up to me and gotten the best of me. I had done something that hurt so many people and could never be undone. When I first came into the prison system, I wanted to push blame on anyone or anything for what I had done but myself. I blamed rap music. I blamed being poor. I blamed growing up in one of the worst neighborhoods in Washington on the Hilltop area in the early 90s, having plexiglass windows on my house so bullets wouldn't come through my windows, having needles in my front lawn, not having a father. The list went on and on. I could blame so many things, I thought. After about 5 years in prison, I started to see I only had myself to blame for my actions. Once I was able to take responsibilities for the choices I made, I was able to start growing into the man that I was meant to be. The man my mother raised me to be, not the foolish, greedy person I had become. A man who cares for other people and not just himself. A man who looks to help others and see in them for who they are, not just what I can get from them or attain from them. I don't know exactly when or why I snapped out of being that other person, but I do know that by doing so, I was able to develop and see where I was going wrong in my life. Today, I know I am a different man. I want to help other confused young men change before they make the same mistakes I've made. I've learned the value of education and am in the process of earning a college degree, something I'd never thought I'd do considering I dropped out of school in the 8th grade. I'm a husband to a wonderful woman and a father to 2 beautiful young children. I'm a man who will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the wrongs I've caused and hurt I've caused to others. I'm also a man who now makes choices based on how they will affect others, not just myself. I'm able to see the big picture and not just my own little world. The man who came into prison all those years ago, I would never recognize because I'm not that man today. Thank you.